Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens.
Broadcast from later, Macy Siu, Valdis Silins, Udit Vira, myself, Robert Bolton, and our friend Jayar La Fontaine. Weak signals are simply data points that indicate significant change could be underway. We scan for weak signals in order to sense and make sense of emerging events and issues that may have a significant impact on a system. It is a foundational phase of the foresight process. The squad from later is continuously seeking out weak signals, and with broadcasts like this one, we're offering a view into the process of us sharing and talking through a bunch of things we don't really understand yet we think might be important in shaping futures. Everybody was asked to bring in a weak signal of change from the peripheries of their radar. Valdis, what's your weakest signal?
You selected me because you know I have controversial ones. I decided to go with like a not safe for work one, which is this idea of like silicone hotties. And there was an article in Days Digital, and it has to do with people who are pursuing plastic surgery to such an extent that like they almost become like inhuman figures. Like they push the plastic surgery to the limit of what the body can take, right? So a typical breast enhancement is like 50 to 100 cc's. They're going like 7,000 cc's, like just so massive that it kind of doesn't even look human anymore. And I think you have to see some of these to believe it, because they feel like cartoon characters in a lot of ways, but it's real and it's happening. And the article is interesting because it kind of dives into, well, it interviews them, so it doesn't put a judgment on it particularly. It's just like, why are you doing this? Like, I think what interests me is the kind of like gap or the tension between something that on the one hand to me feels a little like obviously like external beauty standards and stuff like that. Like they're not like pursuing plastic surgery techniques that are making them look like actually inhuman or something like that. It's all the stereotypical like things like lips, breasts, ass, things like that. But at the same time, it kind of pushes beyond, like it looks kind of monstrous as well. So as a signal, I'm not sure how to take it. I think this idea of like plastic surgery almost becoming like an extreme sport. Like she in the interview mentions almost dying multiple times through these surgeries and her body physically being unable to like handle it, and yet pursuing it with the same level of fidelity as like somebody who's rock climbing or whatever, to see what the body could do.
What are some of the standards that are evolving? Like, is it like competitive, or are these people like sharing and like, do they have their own kind of community specific, and like features that they're all trying to achieve together?
Well, there was a piece, I don't know if you guys read it, by Gia Tolentino in I think the New Yorker on like duck face surgery, which has been like all the stuff around like how selfie culture is shaping plastic surgery and the kinds of things people are asking for that looks good in selfies. And I think that could be related because a lot of these people have, these like extreme surgery people have big followings on Instagram and whatnot. I actually wondered how they made money, like, because she spent over $100,000 on it, and it's not answered. Like, I don't know what the answer is.
Like maybe they just have jobs and save money, like, you know. She works at the bank or whatever.
Let's say it's $100K. Yeah. No, but I was wondering if like people are like, is it like a Patreon style thing? Is it like,
especially if they have followings?
This? Yeah, if they have followings. Yeah, are people gifting money? You know, are there influencers? Like, what brands would like sponsor somebody? Like,
so what do you think it signals? What does this mean for culture, for aesthetics, for health?
Well, I think it's probably like, I think it's ambiguous. I think that's how I would like put it. Like, I'm not sure what it signals. Like, I just see it happening and I'm like, what is going on? Why is that happening? And the Instagram feedback loop is like one thing, and reality, celebrity culture, and all of that nexus. And the normalization of plastic surgery is another.
That's definitely happening.
Is the trend, do you find, or from what you've read, generally gendered? Like, is it often more women?
Yeah, I think that was like that was the side that I was saying, like, yeah, it makes me want to be almost like judgmental in some way, in the sense of like, it's like obviously the stereotypical stuff around like what makes like a woman attractive and whatnot. I would imagine with men, like I'm waiting for like, I mean, you guys all know probably what I would say, but like penis enhancements are like the biggest male surgeries, like by far for plastic surgeries. And so like extreme male, I don't know if that exists, like, but I could totally imagine it existing. It's maybe less like likely to be photographed and stuff like that.
Don't they find these like extreme body parts actually like cumbersome to movement and like everyday life?
To breathing. She's
Yeah.
having breathing problems because it's too heavy. Yeah.
I think there's a related trend in like the world of bodybuilding actually. Both men and women participate in bodybuilding, but I think especially among like extreme male bodybuilders, there's like
synthol.
Synthol, exactly.
Yeah.
Synthol
What's
injecting. Synthol is like a substance that you can inject subcutaneously into your muscles in order to sort of make them look like they're enormous, but it doesn't look real, I suppose. Like if you see a synthol injection, like a bicep that's been injected with synthol, it looks like a bag of jelly. And people do it to like their abdomen or like their pectoral muscles and things like that. And then of course there's also just guys who take enormous amounts of steroids. Like I don't know if any of you are familiar with Rich Piana. He was a famous like Instagram bodybuilder, and his thing was just to get as big as he conceivably could. And I think he died like a couple of years ago. Just like I think it was like a massive heart attack or something from an enormous overdose of these types of substances. And to see these people like what beauty standards they're striving for is really anybody's guess. I think it kind of, to your point, Valdis, in a way goes beyond those things.
Cosmetic maximalism.
Yeah.
I mean, the signal might be just that we're becoming more open-minded to alien beauty standards, which is kind of a cool one. Like we do have certain things like that, like even tattoos or something that are like, there's nothing natural about what they look like, even though they're age old and kind of like long held ancestral kind of traditions. But
are any of these plastic surgeries functional in any way? Like, is it beyond just cosmetic? Do you know?
Penis enhancement is
yeah, penis enhancement, I guess, is functional in some sense.
I mean, how is that more functional? I hope it would be breast enhancement. But yeah.
I know it's equally functional at most, maybe, right? Yeah.
Yeah, functional in what sense, though? Like,
well, I mean, the way I was thinking about steroids is that steroids actually do have some functional element, right? Whereas synthol is purely aesthetic. And so I was wondering if there is anything functional at all about the enhancements that you were talking about this.
I think plastic surgery in general, there's been a big movement of people who've had like breast cancer.
Mastectomy.
Yeah, and there's been like a movement around like normalizing plastic surgery for things like that to not be like a stigmatized thing, because you never know what somebody's been through. But that's, as far as I know, like the closest I can think of to functional. Even the very term plastic surgery implies that it's not functional, right?
Yeah.
So functional would be like having sort of more functional breathing, I guess, as opposed
to
normal
surgery.
So it would be not cosmetic, right? It would be a surgery that's just like augmenting the functions.
Yeah, enhancing like growing your rib cage so that your lungs can expand more or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
More oxygen.
I think there is also a connection to social media in that, let's say you are a fitness model or something on Instagram, you're kind of, if you're in the middle of the pack, you're like one of thousands or perhaps even tens of thousands, right? But if you seek one of these enhancements, you're put into this like more rarefied category of like especially noteworthy individuals who have some kind of thing that sets them apart, right? So from the perspective of like attracting followers or attracting likes and these types of things, it almost operates like there's a concept in biology of like a super stimuli. The red dots on a bird, let's say, they're meant to sort of attract the activity of like their chicks, right? So the chicks see like a giant red dot and they know that like it's feeding time. The dot doesn't need to be that big in order to stimulate that behavior, but because it's that big, it will definitely stimulate that behavior. So I kind of see a little bit of a relationship between like these, whether it's enormous muscles or like enormous breasts or whatever, as like a super stimuli that attract attention of some kind.
And it seems to work on some level. I think also it's like maybe what you would expect within the patterns of how competition and differentiation work, and it almost like rhymes with like the politicians you end up with and like these other kinds of things. And it comes to like, this is how we're going to make noise and differentiate and distinguish ourselves from the pack, right?
Yeah, along the same line, also think like it could tie into just like maximalist as one distinction in terms of expression. So like, I mean, there's been a history of artists using their bodies as canvas, and so maybe they're like, now I'm using this maximalist approach of my own body to express myself in ways that are like novel.
Yeah, the connection to artistry is like interesting because there's also like an injunction for everybody to be an artist today, right? And like depending on how you want to interpret that injunction, the more cynical one is that that's a way to get people to not feel alienated inside of a system that exists to extract labor from them, right? And then, but if you're all artists, then it's like you shouldn't feel alienated because and work becomes like a work of art. Your body becomes a work of art. There's always like something that you're like working on that's expressive, that's non-alienated in some way, and it's a weird nexus, I guess, of work and artistry. Like sort of social media is a weird nexus of work and artistry, right? And the blurring of those two, because it's always about building a brand and a following, and it's very work-like. But at the same time, you have all this like artistry side of like expressing yourself on it and whatever, and you're always like swinging between those poles.
Yeah, if it's a signal of maximalism, I'm into that. Minimalism's been getting played out. I'm going to say signal. Can we go through Udit, signal or noise?
I think it's a signal.
Macy?
Yeah, I'd say it's a signal.
All right. Valdis, you obviously think it's a signal. Unanimous. First time ever. All right. Jayar, let's hear your weakest signal.
Yeah, so I don't know about you guys, but I've always had a hard time visualizing supply chains and understanding how they work, I suppose. It just seems like an endlessly kind of like labyrinthine topic. And so it's always kind of scared me a little bit. And I think some of the things I'm seeing now are in a way demystifying how supply chains work and teaching me a little bit about their vulnerabilities and really how fragile some of these are, especially when it comes to, supplies of goods that are highly consolidated in very specific geographic areas. So the signal that I saw recently was apparently there's an egg shortage going on in the UK in supermarkets. And the reason for the shortage is not that they don't have enough, hens producing eggs, and not that they don't have enough refrigerated trucks to bring the eggs to the market. It's because they don't have enough cartons to stack the eggs in. And the reason that they don't have enough cartons in the UK is apparently most of Europe is supplied by 3 egg carton manufacturers, and the largest of those carton manufacturers is in Denmark, and they are shuttered for the next couple of weeks. They've just completely closed down the facility. And so to me, it's really instructive to think that, the entire UK is undergoing this kind of like egg shortage mini crisis because, we can't get the little cardboard holders that you can rest the eggs on to the distribution factories to load the eggs into that get them to the market. So I think it's a nice illustration of just how fragile supply chains can be. We kind of think that like there are all these incredible redundancies and backup plans and so on and so forth. But if the entire ability to deploy eggs into a market in the entire continent of Europe is dependent on 3 facilities, I think that's just an interesting way of thinking about supply. And then I also wonder, like, these things are mostly invisible to us because they work the way that they ought to. I think especially in developed countries that don't experience things like shortage of goods and so on as a fact of life, like we've just become very used to going to a market, and the thing we want at the market is at the market, and then that's the whole story, right? We don't really ever have to think about all the services that are required, goods and services required to get that thing there. And so I wonder whether this marks a kind of, the end of a kind of naive vision of how things are supplied in the general sort of understanding of things, where we'll be a little bit more just aware of how things get to us and how they don't get to us. So because I like to think in terms of analogies, like there's a whole discipline within cognitive science of what they call deficit studies, which is based on the notion that you can learn a lot about the normal functioning of a faculty, let's say your ability to form beliefs or thoughts or whatever, or to recognize a face. Your ability to recognize a face is highly dependent on like some very specific subsystems in your brain. And if there's a deficit in one of those systems, then something that you would think is very natural and normal, like looking at somebody and knowing who they are, is impossible. So I wonder if we're going to learn a lot about supply chains through these deficits to understand things that would otherwise be, oh, of course I go to the grocery store and there are all these things. Well, why are there no eggs, right? If you were to ask me that question, my answer would not have been because there are no cartons. Right? It just seems very strange. So I think that this might signal like the kind of end of a supply chain naivete.
Right. Interesting. I don't suspect that it will be the end of supply chain naivete, but I do find it an interesting signal for those that will pay attention. I mean, it's a signal for me because I have that same naivety and will paying attention, but somehow I don't think it's going to make, for most people, I don't think people will be able to start thinking differently about that often. It's interesting. The other signal within that, it's very interesting to like break it down as Denmark is taking care of the safety of its workers, I presume. Therefore, no one gets eggs.
Right.
It's like no one can get eggs anywhere. So that's, it's interesting though. I like it as a signal for myself.
Yeah, and I just to add one more thing, I wonder if there will be more of a kind of a push, politically speaking, towards more localism in terms of this of supply, right? So rather than be dependent on these highly fragile, consolidated systems,
more distributed, more resilient.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically.
So there might, politically speaking, you could see a kind of a shift towards, on balance, towards things that support more local manufacturing, distribution, and so on.
I wonder if there is some way to audit what are the most sort of fragile, but otherwise really easy to produce things like this, so that you could like have a business in like retooling a factory or something in order to produce these types of things that are sort of like inevitable disruptions waiting to happen.
I mean, you could also say that maybe nothing has gone wrong in the sense that it's just too early for the supply chain to have reconstituted itself, and the whole system of like pricing, I'm presuming eggs will go up in price because they're just less supply and whatever, will create an incentive for like somebody else to set up a carton manufacturing business on shore that has a little bit of a runway, and so British people don't get eggs for a month or two, like big deal. That's not the end of anybody's world. I mean, except for a few.
And also, I think
chickens.
this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Like, I don't know if you guys remember this. I think it was like a couple of decades ago. There was this like Angostura bitters crisis where people who were like cocktail fanatics were like stocking up on Angostura because I believe it was either like the bottle or like one specific ingredient, and like Angostura has like a secret recipe, right? Like one of the ingredients was in short supply, and so they completely stopped the manufacture of Angostura. So all these like people, I remember people in my family who were all like gin and tonic drinkers were like buying up Angostura to make sure that they had a constant supply of Angostura for the gin and tonics. So it has happened in the past. This instance, though, I think there's like an interesting point to be made about like local and like the fact that we're all kind of like dependent on these like an international integrated economy, which we don't have control over at all, right? So I think that's what it would signal for me, as opposed to like the sort of like invisible hand of the market and things kind of, or the supply chain being so decentralized that it's hard to kind of witness.
So you want more expensive cartons produced in Britain, for Britons, by Britons.
Maybe.
I like that when you ask
Danes and their technology.
When you ask why the price of eggs is up so much, it's like, no, the eggs are the same price. The cartons, they're $5 cartons now. You could bring your own carton. Maybe that's the...
Bring your own bowl, something else.
It's a pretty easy thing, though, to have. It's just a carton that's reusable. You just put your eggs in there.
The other thing I was thinking about in light of COVID, though, is like the different kind of cultural choices people make in like when they go out shopping. So one thing that I noticed in like the Indian markets is that people in South India have stopped buying chickens because chickens are considered like less, I guess, like pure or whatever, or like more chances of contamination, and they're picking fish over chicken. And fish, to me, in like North America, like the last thing I remember reading was that fish is not being bought as much because it has a shorter shelf life. It's like, and it's like considered, it can go bad more easily and so on. So yeah, it's another question about like what are the cultural forces at play when people make decisions about what they're buying.
That's weird. I feel like I feel those things sometimes. I'm like wondering as I grocery shop in these days and times, and it's like, but then I always kind of default. I have no idea. Then I just get whatever I want. All right, signal and noise. Valdis, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think a signal as like general supply chain literacy,
an
emerging sense of how these things are interoperative, and I think it will have like an implication on localization of production and stuff like that. But that's already been going on, so it's just a continuation of that trend, I think.
Macy?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just will better inform the public in terms of making choices on what they buy.
Udit?
Yeah, I agree with both of those points too. I think it's a signal.
The signal. All right. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
I'm calling mine the little cockroachy robot that could.
The little what?
So the little cockroachy robot
Okay.
that could. Yeah, I was just reading about insect scale, fast moving, ultra robust soft robots. So they've developed really targeting mobility and robustness as like engineering challenges. They've developed a 3 centimeter by 1.5 centimeter soft robot that has a curved body and like structure that essentially moves like a cockroach and mimics animal locomotion. So it can move up to 20 body lengths and carry a load of 1 million times its weight. So it's a pretty big feat in terms of it's currently the fastest measured artificial insect scale robot. So it was just interesting in terms of thinking about mimicking nature and also kind of the rise of soft robotics. It was interesting reading about it, and also just seeing how it moves and being able to sustain weight and still be alive, so to say. And also thinking about potential uses for something like this that can climb into crevices like insects, be able to sustain itself within certain environments that just other things cannot get into.
Do they put them into play with one another? Like, are there forms of collective swarm intelligence? Because that's often why people are interested in insects, is like the swarming aspect of inspiration, right? Where higher level intelligence emerges from low level nothingness, right? Like just a yes no kind of a decision. Or is it just that it influences like the body plan of the robot?
I think it's
like
mainly around
cockroach like.
Exactly. It's like the way that it moves, that it's able to achieve that speed of locomotion, and as well as like mimicking arthropods in general, that robustness in its shell, but at the same time being something that's soft. I don't think they've looked into like swarm or like collective behavior in this study. It's mainly around locomotion and robustness.
I'm curious about what the possible applications are. I like the idea of like some kind of like new off-road vehicle that's modeled after a cockroach that like a human could operate.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is espionage. So I think like that's like whenever we think about robotic insects, seems to be the clearest like use cases. Innocuous monitoring devices, right? Like if there's like a cockroach that's physically indistinguishable from real, although you might step on it.
But it can withstand the weight of a human stepping on it, so it will still last.
Yeah. That's what I think is like actually the key thing for like what is the use case of this. The first thing I thought of was like, you can't kill a cockroach. Like where would you need situations where you need a robot that people would be trying to kill all the time?
In light of like what's going on right now with COVID, is like aren't cockroaches like the one kind of organism that have survived like multiple extinction events or things like that?
That's what they say. Yeah.
And like if we're about to go through an apocalypse, maybe we are, maybe we're not. Like, shouldn't we be studying the cockroach for its like ability to withstand like apocalyptic events?
So it's a model for our strategic evolution.
Yeah, exactly. We should all live in cockroach bunkers that are just built and shaped like cockroaches.
We should all try to make our future descendants more cockroach-like. It's an interesting overlap with the first signal we had today. It's like, what kind of cockroach surgery can I get to make myself more resilient?
It'd be good as like a like if you were to go into like cryogenic stasis, like instead of having like a doer, like a pod that just sits in the facility, you would just turn the pod into a giant cockroach, and then it could roam around and it can get away from trouble and stuff like that. I'm pretty sure there's a thought experiment. I think it's Daniel Dennett's thought experiment about something like that, like a future where people are all sort of in these mobile pods and
we'll all survive the next apocalypse or the next pandemic.
All right, signal and noise, Udit.
I think like the attention towards cockroaches at this time to me is a signal. Like that is a signal to me.
Yeah.
And like that's the part that I'm interested in. So I would say signal for that reason.
Yeah, I think signal. I think this is like another part of this long-standing interest amongst roboticists when it comes to insect mobility and decision making and all these types of things. And I think for a long time it was purely conceptual, like back in the 90s. We were starting to make some small strides, but like as Valdis says, now we see like real applications of things like swarm technology, swarms of drones that are replacing fireworks displays and things like that. So there's like probably a lot of the early applications will be in entertainment, but I think this is like another part of that like unfolding fascination with insect cognition and mobility.
That's pretty fun. Valdis?
I mean, to be contrarian, I would say for those reasons, I would say it's less signally. But I would say actually, Jayar, that instance that you gave of like the cryogenic cockroach-looking pods, that's like the moment that becomes a signal to me of like, what are the specific, like we need a comparative insectology for like what all these robots might be put to use for. And that I don't think I've seen particularly interesting work on. Yeah, what can we imagine like silk producing robotic spiders being put to use for? How could we repurpose pollination behavior for something else, you know? I don't know what that would be, but not to impregnate flowers, but other kinds of behaviors. And this kind of like insect behavior cabinet for robotics would be very interesting, I think.
Strategic rewilding.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would have maybe gone noise just because it's like, okay, like the nerds are doing robot biomimicry still, but through the conversation, I'm convinced of many signals here. So I say both signal and noise. Udit, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, so my weak signal is a paper that I was reading called Local Targeted Memory Reactivation in Human Sleep. It's in the Journal of Current Biology by these Israeli researchers. And the idea is basically that we know that smell has the power to bring back memories. And we also know that when you're sleeping, memory gets consolidated, right? And so the idea behind this paper is that these researchers have found that you can actually target which memories are consolidated when you're sleeping by releasing scents when you're sleeping. So the impact for me is like learning, like what the implications are for me is towards learning, right? So if you're learning something surrounded with this context of a certain smell, and then that smell is played back to you while you're sleeping, those memories are reactivated, and then you have a better recall for those memories when you're awake. And I'm interested in thinking about this with sort of the other signals that we've talked around a lot in the past, like the self-optimization movement, also like the growth of the sleep tech industry with weighted blankets, cooling pads, and like all these different wearables that are coming out that are tracking your sleep. Yeah, so that's my signal.
So what are the scents that better induce learning?
It's whatever scent that you were smelling while you were learning the thing, and then it was played back to you when you're sleeping. So that memory is reactivated when you're sleeping. And so when you're awake, that thing has just like consolidated during your sleep.
Right, so it's associated scent. So what about like instead of learning, unlearning or taking away memory, or like traumatic memories or painful memories or memories that you don't want?
That's interesting. I wonder if you were doing that while you were doing something like CBT or something, you could actually like improve CBT. I don't know if anyone's studied this, like the effect of like aroma for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's possibly a thing. I don't know.
So I was just thinking about, you've probably all heard that one of the early symptoms of COVID-19 is loss of smell and loss of taste.
Mm-hmm.
And the connection between those two things and memory at a kind of a deep-rooted level. Like I've never lost either of those senses for any length of time, but I do wonder if it has an appreciable impact on your ability to form memories, to not be able to taste and smell, right? If what you're saying, like there's this connection between memory formation and olfactory perception, that if you can't smell, it stands to reason that you might just be worse at making memories or consolidating memories.
I mean, the brain rewires itself in different ways too, though. So those pathways I know people who like lose sight and stuff like that still have some ability to see, although they can like sense hand movements and things like that. And it's not just like air pressure changes in the room. It's like something that's like not fully explained. Maybe I'm going off in a direction I don't know enough about. But this idea of the brain being able to rewire itself to like other, I don't know, sensory substitution pathways or something like that. So if you don't have scent anymore, maybe that weight gets put. I'm not sure how the brain is wired, but whichever was going to that section that was doing the smelling is now linked to something else.
And they have done that, right? They've like remapped like your haptic senses to your like, taste and things like that. I think
your tongue to sight.
Oh yeah, tongue to sight. That's exactly what it is.
The question I have, Udit, for you is like the notion of like what even is a memory in this instance. And I know it's like a bigger issue, but it's like this notion that memory is like a series of discrete things stored in the brain. I'm not sure that the researchers would have that position, but like that's how like often we think of it, which is not, as far as I understand it, the way that most like modern research into what memory is, how they think of it. And memory is like always reconstituted anew every time you think of it. So like there's no fixed memory. It's not like a book on a shelf. It's always like a living thing that's reformed. I'm not sure if that has any implications on the notion of like optimizing your memories as you sleep through like triggering environmental cues. But it made me think of like, what are the underlying presumptions of like what memory is inside of the study?
I wonder if it's making any of those presumptions, right? Because I know the point that you're making, which is that memory, the way they talk about memory now is that it's like a structure of connections, right? Or like, you know, a way that your neurons are firing in concert with each other. And I don't know if it's making any claims about the underlying nature of how memory is, or like a memory is stored in your brain per se. All it's talking about is the recall of that memory and the consolidation of that memory.
Yeah, I feel like from a, I guess, like subjective point of view, when I'm trying to perform recall or like retrieve a memory, for me, I have to like pick around the edges of it sometimes. And if I am trying to remember the contents of a book, let's say, I might try to imagine where I was when I was reading that book. Obviously, think about what the cover looked like, and, you know, things like that. But not necessarily about the memory I'm trying to retrieve, but they're like adjacent to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that, like, you know, eventually, if I do enough of that triangulation, then something of like the thing that I'm looking for kind of comes into view. So having like a smell associated with it is just another like node that you can activate in order to pull the whole thing forward.
It's like a memory palace, right? Like that's the term people use for
it's
like
a memory garden of flowers.
Yeah, well, that's the signal to me. Is like, are we going to see like products or like just different behaviors where people are like, while they're learning, for example, you know, they have like an incense stick or something like that, or a diffuser, aroma diffuser.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they're sleeping, they have the same one going, and you know, and like you get to take that to your exam or whatever as well the next day when you're writing your exam or your test.
It'd be interesting experiment for like a college kid to do, like have an essential oil to wear when studying each discrete subject, and then like wear it to the exam, where it's like
memory coded.
Like, try and like mess with your creativity and like wear them all at once and like go see what kind of connections you can make.
I wonder if there's like an implication that like the kind of combining those 2 points, like the memory becomes worse when you don't have that scent associated with it. Like what you're doing is almost like the reason I was like trying to bring up this idea of skepticism is because there's like an underlying like almost like Pavlovian simplicity to it that feels a little like, I don't know what the details are, so I can't say why it feels a little off to me, but like that model of like one-to-one causality can sometimes feel a little like something else is probably going wrong in the system or might be going wrong in the system. So the idea that maybe you're like training yourself to only associate it with a particular smell and you're even getting worse at it without it or something. I mean, I don't know, you could test for that easily, but what else is happening in that system somewhere else that is unanticipated? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe nothing, but
yeah.
Or also like maybe you'll lose like, it's almost like immunity to that scent. Like if you overuse it, would lose that reinforcement ability.
But the other thing I like about this idea is like the more positive side is, so like, you guys know I've been like studying plants for a long time, and they're a smell machine factory essentially, because their primary way of interacting with each other in the environment is through chemical kind of olfactory scents and things like that, right? They don't have a voice, they can't talk, they don't have that way of communicating, so they communicate through scents. So they attract animals through scents, they repel animals through scents, they pharmacologically manipulate animals through different compounds that also have smells. And so this idea of like us using scents more effectively is almost like us becoming more plant-like, you know, and developing like a cabinet of different like triggering communication systems that are based on scent. I think that idea would be really cool if we could develop that. And we could like we could create common memories and associate it with a scent or something like that with somebody else, and you know, design systems to trigger it with each other and whatever. And
the last place where I want to take this conversation about this particular one is the way the whole article was framed was around the value for like productivity, right? The increase in productivity because you can like improve your learning. Mm-hmm. And so like just like thinking about it as like another example of something which is like trying to push us towards this culture of productivity is like another part of the signal.
Learn while you sleep.
Learn while you sleep. Be more productive while you sleep, and don't waste those 8 hours.
Yeah, I don't know how strong the views are in the literature here. I've seen this signal or one like it before, and I've felt like it was not very well like confirmed, that this is still pretty contentious whether this is working or not. Is that right?
Yeah. In fact, I was talking about this to my partner who's a researcher, and she was like, "Oh, what's the effect size?" And like, I'm pretty sure this wasn't confirmed, and I think it's pretty small. I looked it up, and there were just 30 participants in the study, so that's quite small for something like this. But yeah, I mean, I stumbled upon it and I thought it was like it was weak enough as a signal that I brought it up.
Spend a week replicating it, Udit, at home.
Yeah,
I think there's some interesting things that it brings up in terms of like scent and memory, and like the surrounding constellation of ideas here is pretty interesting to look at. I don't believe it would be like the most effective way to optimize your productivity.
learning. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to go with noise on that note. Macy?
I mean, I'm just curious in terms of like all the surrounding conversation that we've had. So I think with regards to that, it could be more signal, even just like what Valdis was saying in terms of designing through sense.
Macy says signal. Rob says Pavlovian nonsense. No. Jayar?
So I think as a attempt to sort of explore new avenues for learning and how we learn and how we can learn better, I think it's a signal. Like one of my hopes for this entire period is that given that we're undergoing a sort of disruption of normal events and a lot of the ways that we do things like education have been suspended, that this might be an inflection point where we can head off in a little bit of a different direction. Maybe there's some learnings that we can take from this period forward, and if not, entirely break out, then at least make some movements away from the kind of factory model of education, let's call it. And maybe that is this signal, and I guess I'm calling it a signal, is like a small piece of maybe a much larger effort.
For sure. I like the framing of I hope it's a signal. That's actually how I felt about yours, Jayar. But I was like, I don't really think people are going to have this new broad understanding of the supply chain that's all of a sudden enlightened. But yeah, Valdis, signal, noise.
I would say a noise in terms of when you asked about effect sizes. I think my kind of like, I don't know, Bayesian baseline for like understanding scientific psychological studies like this has become very disrupted since the replication crisis. And so anytime these kind of like simple model one-to-one things come along, I've become a lot more skeptical, I think, than I was maybe 5-10 years ago. And I just wonder if it's another one of these things that'll succumb to like the failure to replicate elsewhere, given the small sample size and effects and whatnot. So in that regard, I would call it part of the noise of like the scientific institution as it's set up now and what it produces.
In that sense, noise, but there's lots of interesting stuff within the sphere here.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Yeah. All right, that's broadcast from later.